not their daughter. Not the woman whose medical degree had sat untouched in their closet for an entire year. This was even worse than calling me a nurse. Worse than calling me a babysitter. They had erased everything I had worked for. 7 years of medical school and surgical training. Thousands of overnight shifts in the trauma center. Reduced to someone who simply answered phones. I tightened my jaw and turned toward the dock, ready to say something. Then I saw Colton. He was floating face down about 15 feet from the dock, beyond the point where the shallow green water faded into deep black. He wasn't splashing. He wasn't crying for help. He wasn't moving at all. His arms drifted beside him, and his hair spread across the surface like strands of lake grass. About 20 feet behind him, the neighborhood kids were still laughing near the ladder, completely unaware of what had happened. They kept splashing one another without noticing. Everything else disappeared. Lorraine's voice, the music, the sound of bottles clinking together. It all faded from my ears as though someone had switched off the world. There was only the child, the water, and the job I had been trained to do. Without hesitation, I kicked off my sandals and sprinted toward the edge of the dock. 2 strides later, I dove into the lake. The water shocked me. The surface was warm, but underneath was the icy Tennessee thermocline, and my body sliced through both layers as I swam. 15 feet. I reached Colton within seconds. Using one arm, I rolled him onto his back and supported his head against my shoulder. His lips were blue. His eyes were shut. His chest wasn't rising. Keeping his head above the surface with one arm, I swam back while pulling him with the other. When I reached the dock, the rough wood scraped across my forearm as I lifted him onto the planks. I didn't even notice. I gently tilted his head back, opened his airway, and placed my ear near his mouth. Nothing. No breathing. No movement. Instinct took over. The emergency protocol was no longer something I had to remember. It lived in my hands the way a melody lives in the fingers of a concert pianist. With drowning victims, rescue breaths come first. This wasn't cardiac arrest. It was respiratory arrest. Air before compressions. I pinched his nose, sealed my mouth over his, and delivered the first breath. His small chest rose. I gave a second breath. Again, his chest lifted. Still no response. No coughing. No movement. I immediately began chest compressions. One hand centered on his sternum. He was only 5 years old, and his ribs were delicate. I had to press hard enough to circulate blood without causing unnecessary injury. 30 compressions. Fast. Steady. I counted silently. Then 2 more rescue breaths. Behind me, reality finally caught up. Kristen screamed. A plate shattered somewhere behind us. Grant yelled his son's name. Colton. Colton. Footsteps pounded across the dock. Heavy. Panicked. Shaking the entire structure. I never looked back. I never stopped. Once again, I breathed for my nephew. Another 30 compressions. My hands remained perfectly steady. They had never failed me. Not during a 4-hour operation on a gunshot victim. Not while performing CPR inside an ambulance racing down a rain-soaked highway. And they weren't going to fail me now. Beneath my palm, I could barely feel it. A heartbeat. Weak. But still fighting. During the 3rd cycle, Colton suddenly coughed. A stream of lake water poured from his mouth, splashing across the wooden dock. Then came another cough. Stronger. Deeper. His body jerked beneath my hands. I carefully rolled him onto his side into the recovery position. He gagged twice. Coughed again. Then, finally, the sound I'd been waiting for. A rough, desperate breath. He was breathing. He was crying. He was alive. Keeping him safely on his side, I checked his pulse along the brachial artery inside his upper arm. The pediatric pulse point. His heart was racing, around 140 beats per minute, but it was steady. Strong. His oxygen levels would still need monitoring, but already the color was returning to his face. The blue around his lips slowly faded into pink. Only then did I finally look up. Grant was kneeling beside the dock. His face had turned completely white. He reached toward his son, but his hands were shaking too badly to hold him. Kristen stood behind him with both hands covering her mouth. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Dale stood frozen halfway down the hill. A beer can was still clutched in his hand as though his brain had forgotten how to tell the rest of his body to move. Lorraine remained at the top of the yard with both hands pressed against her face. I carefully lifted Colton and placed him into Grant's arms. "Keep him on his side," I instructed. "If he throws up again, let him. Don't roll him onto his back." Grant clung tightly to his son. "Piper, how did you?" "I cut him off. Someone call 911. Tell them it's a pediatric drowning. The patient is responsive, but needs immediate evaluation. Tell EMS we'll meet them at the top of the driveway." I wasn't making suggestions. I was giving orders. It was the same voice I used at 3 o'clock in the morning whenever a trauma patient rolled through the emergency doors, and every second meant the difference between life and death. The doc fell silent. For the first time I could remember. My family listened to every word I said. The ambulance arrived 14 minutes later. 2 paramedics hurried down the slope carrying pediatric equipment and a portable cardiac monitor. The lead medic, a solidly built man in his 40s with a shaved head and remarkably calm hands, knelt beside Colton and immediately began assessing him. Pulse oximeter reading 91 and climbing. Respiratory rate 22. No obvious signs of aspiration. He shined a penlight into Colton's eyes. Both pupils equal and reactive. Then he looked directly at me. "Who started CPR?" "I did." "What protocol?" 2 rescue breaths first. Then 30 compressions. He responded during the 3rd cycle. Estimated submersion time was under 2 minutes. Total CPR lasted roughly 90 seconds. The paramedic studied me carefully. The way experienced medical professionals recognize another clinician, not by appearance, but by the confidence, precision, and language they use. The paramedic looked at me for another moment. "You're a trauma surgeon?" he asked. I nodded. "UT Medical Center." He gave me a single nod in return. Not a nod of surprise. A nod of professional recognition. "Your experience gave this little guy the best chance he could have had," he said. Leading with rescue breaths was exactly the right call. Textbook drowning response. He secured another strap across Colton's stretcher before continuing. "We'll take him in for observation, but from everything I'm seeing, you gave him the opportunity for a full recovery." Grant stood beside the stretcher, refusing to let go of Colton's hand. Kristen remained a few steps behind him with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Dale had finally reached the bottom of the hill. At some point, he dropped the beer can onto the grass without even realizing it. Every one of them had heard what the paramedic said. Lorraine, standing near the back of the group, was the first to speak. "Well, I mean, anybody would have known what to do." The paramedic didn't even bother turning around. He was adjusting Colton's oxygen mask while fastening the final straps. Without looking up, he answered, "Ma'am, nearly 90% of bystanders freeze during a pediatric drowning." He glanced briefly over his shoulder. What she did wasn't instinct. It was professional training. The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Colton, sleepy beneath the oxygen mask, reached one small hand toward me. "Aunt Piper, you're coming too, right?" I smiled. "I'm right behind you, buddy." The ambulance transported Colton to UT Medical Center in Knoxville, the nearest Level 1 trauma center. My hospital. I followed behind in my own car. I was still wearing the clothes I'd jumped into the lake with. Wet shorts. A soaked tank top. Hair stiff from dried lake water. No scrubs. No white coat. No stethoscope. Even my hospital ID badge was buried inside my bag beneath a damp towel. Grant rode in the ambulance with Colton. Kristen drove separately with Dale and Lorraine. Darlene came as well. She claimed she was there for emotional support. Personally, I suspected she simply wanted to see how everything unfolded. We all gathered in the emergency department waiting room. The very same waiting room I walked past hundreds of times every week on my way to the trauma base. The same chairs where I'd watched families collapse with relief after hearing their loved one would survive, or break apart after I told them we'd done everything possible. Now, I was the one sitting there. The fluorescent lights buzzed exactly the same. The smell of disinfectant and worn linoleum hadn't changed. The only difference, this time I was on the wrong side of the doors. Colton was taken for a pediatric evaluation. Grant paced the hallway. Kristen gripped her phone so tightly I could see her knuckles widening from across the room. Dale sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead like someone stranded in a country whose language he couldn't understand. A nurse walked past carrying a clipboard. She glanced through the glass partition,
Paused.
looked again. I recognized her immediately. Maria. Night shift. She recognized me too. Dr. Briggs. She stopped in her tracks. Is that really you? You're not scheduled today. Are you working? I gave a slight shake of my head and quietly mouthed, not now. She held my gaze for a second, understood instantly, nodded once, and continued walking. Across the room, Grant looked at me. Did she just call you doctor? I met his eyes. That's what everyone at work calls me. Hospital waiting rooms distort time. 5 minutes can feel like half an hour. No one understood silence less than Lorraine. Whenever the room became quiet, she filled it with her own version of events. She leaned toward Darlene, speaking loudly enough that everyone nearby could hear. She was already rebuilding the afternoon into something that fit the story she'd always preferred. Everything happened so quickly, she sighed. 1 minute Colton was swimming, the next thing I knew. She paused dramatically. Honestly, thank God Grant reached him when he did. I was sitting only a few chairs away. I reached him, Mom, not Grant. She didn't hesitate. Well, yes, you were in the water too. She waved her hand dismissively. You helped. But the ambulance people said almost anyone could have done it. I looked directly at her.
No.
The paramedic said exactly the opposite. You were standing there when he said it. Her fingers tightened around her purse strap. I'm only saying we shouldn't argue about who deserves credit. The important thing is that Colton is all right. I nodded. You're right. The important thing is that Colton survived. I leaned forward. So maybe stop telling people a version of today where I wasn't the one who saved him. The room became completely still. That strange kind of silence where everyone is listening, but no one wants to admit it. Kristen stared down at her hands. Dale cleared his throat. Darlene suddenly found the floor fascinating. Lorraine slowly smoothed the front of her skirt with one deliberate motion before turning toward the wall.
She didn't argue.
She didn't apologize. She simply stopped talking. For Lorraine, that was the closest thing to surrender I'd ever seen. I leaned back in my chair. For years she'd rewritten my career every time she introduced me at church dinners or neighborhood gatherings. But she couldn't rewrite something 20 people had watched happen with their own eyes just 2 hours earlier. And for the first time, the truth was finally catching up with the story she'd been telling. About 5 minutes later, Grant found me standing alone in the hallway. His face looked devastated. The kind of expression parents wear in the emergency room once the adrenaline fades and the reality of what almost happened finally settles in. He stopped in front of me, opened his mouth,
Closed it.
tried again. Finally, he managed to speak. Piper, if you hadn't been there. His voice cracked. If you hadn't. I answered quietly. But I was. He covered his eyes with both hands. I should have listened when you said Colton needed a life jacket. I should have been watching the water. His shoulders sagged. Instead, I was distracted by the retaining wall while my son. I didn't let him avoid it. Yes. You should have been watching him. He flinched. I didn't soften the truth. Some lessons only matter when they carry their full weight. After a long silence, he spoke again. And for years, he swallowed hard. I've failed you too, Piper. I should have told Mom and Dad the truth about what you do, about who you really are. I told Colton the truth, but I never told them. Why not? I asked. Grant lowered his eyes, carrying the same expression our father always wore whenever facing something difficult. Because it was easier, he admitted quietly. As long as Mom and Dad were praising me, I never had to challenge them for putting you down. I let his confession hang in the air. It was painfully honest, and although it had come years too late, it took real courage to say it aloud. I don't need an apology, Grant, I replied. What I need is for you to stop accepting the version of me they've created. He nodded slowly, like someone finally realizing a debt he'd ignored for years had finally come due. For a decade, I worked endlessly to earn respect from people who never bothered to notice me. Every shift I saved lives, then returned home to a family that introduced me as nothing more than the babysitter. But what happened next in that waiting room was something no amount of explaining or correcting had ever accomplished. A single sentence from one unexpected person changed everything. And if someone you love has ever been underestimated by their own family, share this story with them. I returned to the waiting room and sat down again. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. In the corner, the vending machine rattled through another cycle. Lorraine stared at a hand-washing brochure as though it held the answers to every problem she'd ever faced. Then the double doors swung open. Dr. Rebecca Calloway entered with confident strides. Tall, silver-haired, and wearing a perfectly pressed white coat, she crossed the hallway while a resident hurried beside her trying to keep up. She was discussing patient charts without slowing down, scanning the room with the same sharp eyes she used in every trauma case. Quick, precise, and always observant. Her gaze swept across the vending machines, past Dale, past Lorraine, past Grant standing by the window, and stopped on me. She froze. The resident, still talking, accidentally bumped into her shoulder. She barely noticed. Instead, she tilted her head the way she always did whenever something didn't add up, when lab results told one story, but the patient told another. Without hesitation, she walked directly toward me. Her white coat moved with every confident step, the stethoscope lightly tapping against her chest until she stopped beside my chair. Dr. Briggs. She spoke exactly the way she always did, professional, calm, and completely matter-of-fact. Normally those words meant nothing unusual, but inside that waiting room, surrounded by my family, they landed like fireworks in complete darkness. Lorraine jerked her head up from the pamphlet. Dale gripped the armrest of his chair. Kristen went completely still. Grant slowly turned away from the window. Completely unaware of the shock she'd just caused, Dr. Calloway continued. Why are you sitting out here? If your family's in the back, I can personally take you through. I smiled politely. I'm here with my family. My nephew is the child who came in after the drowning. Recognition crossed her face. Your nephew? She paused for only a moment. The CPR performed at the scene was flawless. Then she looked at me again. Wait, that was you? I simply nodded. Of course it was. She turned toward the rest of my family. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't making a speech. She was simply providing information the same way physicians fill in missing medical details. You must all be incredibly proud, she said naturally. Piper is one of the finest trauma surgeons on our staff. She gestured toward me. The rescue she performed today, providing rescue breaths before compressions during a pediatric drowning without any equipment, is an advanced skill that many emergency physicians would struggle to perform outside a hospital. She delivered every word the way doctors read patient charts. Not praise, just facts. Silence followed. Lorraine opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again. We know she works here. Dr. Calloway tilted her head again. Works here? She looked genuinely confused. No, ma'am. She doesn't simply work here. She's one of our attending trauma surgeons, fully board certified. Last month, she managed our trauma bay alone during the Route 33 multi-vehicle accident. 9 critical patients. Every one of them survived. I personally nominated her for this region's Surgical Excellence Award. She paused briefly before adding one final detail. And she's currently under consideration for Deputy Chief of Trauma Surgery next fiscal year. Then she smiled politely. But I'm sure all of you already knew that. The silence afterward felt almost physical. It filled every corner of the waiting room. Darlene looked toward Lorraine. Lorraine stared at the floor. Dale couldn't take his eyes off his own hands. Kristen stood frozen, lips slightly parted. Grant slowly closed his eyes. Only then did Dr. Calloway notice the strange tension in the room. She glanced between me and my family. Did I interrupt something? No, I answered quietly. You said exactly what needed to be said. Still confused, She looked around once more. I'm sorry. I assumed everyone already knew. Then she asked the question that no one seemed able to answer. What exactly did they think you did here? Lorraine remained silent. So I answered for her, calmly and without bitterness. They think I'm just a nurse. Dr. Calloway looked from me to Lorraine, then back at me again. A quiet understanding settled over her face, a mixture of disbelief and the sadness that comes from suddenly realizing how much a colleague has been carrying in silence. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. She gently touched my arm and said, I'll personally check on your nephew. He's receiving excellent care. With that, she disappeared through the double doors, leaving the waiting room behind. The silence didn't last long. Lorraine slowly stood. The confidence she'd been holding together was beginning to crack. It showed in her trembling hands and the strain in her voice.
Now hold on, she said.
I've always told people she works at the hospital. Always. I've always supported her. I don't understand why she's making it sound like. Darlene, a quiet voice interrupted. It was almost soft enough to miss. Lorraine, 2 hours ago at the lake you told me she handed out bandages. I never said that. And you also told me she answered phones. Another woman spoke up, the family friend from the porch who had come to the hospital with everyone else. She sat in the corner, clutching her purse as she spoke. Lorraine turned toward me. Her eyes had filled with tears. You don't understand, she whispered. I was only trying to. Your grandmother. Her words stopped there. She couldn't force them any farther. I waited. The silence between us felt familiar, the same patient silence I used before giving difficult news to families. No pressure. No interruption. Just time. When she couldn't continue, I finished the sentence for her. I know about Grandma Rose's mom. I know you were only 14. I know she died on a country road after delivering a baby, while you were waiting at school for the play she never got to watch. And I know you've spent your whole life terrified that the same thing would happen to me. Lorraine sank back into her chair, as though her legs had given up supporting her. Dale quietly reached for her hand. This time she didn't pull away. His face carried the look of someone who had suddenly realized he'd been standing on the wrong side of the truth for years. But Mom, I continued, my voice calm. Instead of telling me you were scared, you told everyone I answered phones. Instead of asking me about my career, you erased it. You weren't protecting me from medicine. You were protecting yourself from admitting that I chose this life and that I'm good at it. She stayed silent. Her free hand pressed hard against her leg, fingers spread wide as though she needed something solid to hold on to. Dale cleared his throat. Pip, I'm sorry. He looked at Lorraine.
Then at me.
Then down at the floor. I should have come to your graduation ceremonies. I convinced myself you didn't need us. I was wrong. I nodded. It wasn't enough to erase the past. But it was the first completely honest thing he'd said to me in years, and honesty deserved acknowledgement. You don't owe me an apology today, I said. You owe me the truth. The next time someone asks what your daughter does for a living, tell them the truth. Not your version. My version. Grant finally spoke from across the room. I'll make sure they do. I turned back to Lorraine. I love you, Mom. But I won't let you teach Colton that my work doesn't matter. He's already the only person in this family who's proudly called me a doctor. Lorraine lowered her eyes. That one hit home. The truth was, every one of them had known. They had simply chosen a story that was easier to repeat. About 20 minutes later, Dr. Calloway returned with an update. Colton's chest X-ray is completely clear, she said. Both lungs sound normal. His oxygen saturation is at 98%. There's no evidence of aspiration pneumonia. We'll keep him overnight for observation because that's standard procedure after a pediatric drowning, but I expect a complete recovery. Then she smiled at me. He's asking for his aunt. Together, we walked into the pediatric room. Colton lay propped up against several pillows with a nasal oxygen cannula resting beneath his nose. Wrapped in the white hospital blankets, he looked much smaller than usual. The moment we entered, his eyes searched the room until they found me. Piper. The doctor said I'm going to be okay. I sat beside him on the bed. She's absolutely right, buddy. You're one tough little guy. He stretched into a huge yawn, the kind only an exhausted 5-year-old can manage after surviving the scariest day of his life. They said somebody gave me really good CPR. His eyelids were already getting heavy. Was it you? I smiled. Yeah, buddy. It was me. A sleepy grin spread across his face. I knew it. Because you're a doctor. I leaned down and kissed his forehead. His skin felt warm. His heartbeat was steady beneath the thin hospital gown. Get some sleep, Colton. His eyes slowly closed. I remained beside him for another quiet minute, listening to the gentle rhythm of his breathing and feeling grateful that this time, it was the sound of life. When I finally lifted my eyes, my mother, Lorraine, was standing quietly in the doorway. There were no neighbors, no church friends, and no audience to impress. Just a mother looking at the daughter she had never truly understood. Neither of us spoke. Some conversations need more than a single moment to unfold. The week that followed came together in scattered moments. On Tuesday, Grant called me. He told me he had taken my medical school diploma and board certification to a framing shop in Maryville. Both were now hanging on the wall behind his desk at Briggs Construction, right beside his contractor's license. I should have done this years ago, he admitted. Yes, I replied. You should have. A long silence followed. It wasn't the awkward silence of avoidance anymore. It was the quiet weight of someone finally accepting the truth. Wednesday evening, Dad left me a voicemail. It lasted nearly 2 minutes. Most of it was nothing but silence. I could hear his breathing, the creak of the porch swing beneath him, and several unfinished sentences. Finally, just before the recording ended, his voice cracked. I'm sorry I never came to your graduation ceremonies, Pip. I kept telling myself you didn't need your old man there. I was wrong. Then he hung up. It was the longest heartfelt message he'd given me in over a year. Thursday, Kristen sent a text. I'm sorry about what I said, that daycare comment. It was wrong. I replied with 2 simple words. Thank you. That was the entire exchange, and somehow it was enough. Lorraine, however, remained silent. No phone call, no message, no unexpected visit carrying a casserole and an apology. I wasn't expecting one. For as long as I could remember, my mother had been skilled at reshaping reality into something easier for herself to accept. One difficult afternoon in a hospital waiting room wasn't going to erase decades of that habit. But the following Sunday, Darlene told me something. After church, someone had asked Lorraine about her children. This time she answered, my son owns a construction company, and my daughter is a trauma surgeon at UT Medical Center. No minimizing. No excuses. No, she helps around the hospital. For the first time in 10 years, she simply spoke the truth. She didn't say it to me. She said it to the congregation, the people whose opinions mattered most to her. And somehow, that meant even more than an apology would have. I didn't win because my supervisor walked into that waiting room. I had already won years earlier. The first time I stood beneath the bright operating room lights with a scalpel in my hand and realized, without a single doubt, that I was exactly where I belonged. The incident at the lake simply forced everyone else to catch up. Maybe my family will still need time, but I no longer wait for anyone's approval to know my worth. I've always known who I am. Every time I step into surgery, I'm reminded of it. That's my story. One family gathering, one child rescued from drowning, and one ordinary word spoken by a colleague that unraveled 10 years of misunderstanding in just a few seconds. If this story reminded you that your value isn't determined by people who fail to recognize it, hold on to that truth. Share this story with someone who needs that reminder today. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.